I always thought my life was straightforward. Work hard, love harder, and everything else would fall into place. 4 years, that belief held true. Laura and I had built a life together that seemed solid, at least to me. I put in long hours at the office, not because I wanted to, but because I believed it was for us, our future, our stability, our dreams. I never thought to question her loyalty, her love. But now, looking back, the signs had always been there, scattered like breadcrumbs I refused to follow. It started with little things, the kind of shifts in behavior you'd dismiss if you weren't paying close attention. Laura began spending more time on her phone, always tilting the screen away when I walked by. She started coming home later from work, claiming meetings were running long or she was grabbing drinks with coworkers. At first, I shrugged it off. Everyone needs their space, I told myself. She deserved her freedom just as much as I deserved her trust. One evening, as I walked into the kitchen, I caught the tail end of her phone conversation. It was muffled and quick, but the way she laughed, a kind of giddy teenage laugh I hadn't heard in years, made my stomach churn. She hung up the moment she noticed me, brushing it off with a quick excuse about work. That moment stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, but I told myself not to be paranoid. After all, I wasn't the kind of husband to snoop or question her every move. I thought we were better than that. But then, things started piling up. I'd find myself waking up in the middle of the night to see her phone screen glowing on the bedside table, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. Her explanations felt rehearsed, too neat, as though she had anticipated my questions long before I asked them. There were times she came home smelling of cologne that wasn't mine, offering no more than a casual comment about someone at the office wearing too much. I didn't press her. I didn't want to know, at least, not yet. It wasn't until a Saturday morning, when I overheard her in the hallway, that everything began to unravel. She was on the phone again, speaking softly but with an edge of excitement I hadn't heard in years. I couldn't make out much, but one name came through clearly: Jack. I knew Jack. He was her coworker, someone she mentioned occasionally in passing. I'd never thought twice about him. Now, though, his name hit me like a punch to the gut. I stayed rooted in place, pretending not to notice as she walked into the next room. That afternoon, while she was out, I let my guard down and decided to do something I never thought I would: search her phone. It felt wrong, invasive, but something in me had shifted. I couldn't keep ignoring the sinking feeling in my chest. Her messages were locked, but her recent call log wasn't. There it was, Jack's name over and over again, at all hours of the day. Calls in the middle of the night. Missed calls during her late meetings. My hands shook as I put the phone down. I didn't need to dig further. I already knew. But knowing and accepting are two different things. I spent the rest of that day in a haze, questioning everything. How long had this been going on? Was it just Jack? Or were there others? Every interaction we'd ever had suddenly felt tainted, as though I could no longer separate what was real from what was a lie. I wanted to confront her then and there, to demand the truth, but a small, stubborn part of me needed more. If I was going to accuse her, I needed to be sure. I started paying closer attention, keeping mental notes of her comings and goings. It didn't take long to confirm my worst fears. Over the next week, I noticed her growing more careless, as though she no longer cared to hide her actions. There were more late nights, more hushed phone calls, more suspicious receipts in her purse. She even began dressing differently, trading her usual modest outfits for something flashier, more daring. I recognized the signs of someone trying to impress. The breaking point came when I overheard her talking on the phone late at night. She was in the living room, unaware that I had woken up. This time, there was no doubt. Her voice was playful, teasing, and full of promises she had no business making. "Next time, I'll make it up to you," she said, her words slicing through the quiet like a blade. I didn't need to hear the rest. My suspicions were no longer suspicions. They were fact. As I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep when she finally came upstairs, I felt a quiet rage bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of everything I had built my life around. For the first time in years, I found myself questioning the very foundation of who I was. And as much as it hurt, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not yet. Once I had confirmation in my heart, the gnawing question became, how deep did her betrayal go? I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to see the full picture, to make sense of how far this had spiraled. My mind, once focused on work and home, became a relentless machine piecing together fragments of her lies. Every glance she avoided, every excuse she rehearsed, it all began to take on a sinister clarity. That week, I decided to dig further, though the act made me feel like a stranger in my own skin. I hated myself for what I was about to do, but I hated her more for putting me in this position. I went through her laptop while she was at work. She always kept it open, never bothering with passwords, likely because she assumed I'd never stoop to this level. And maybe I never would have if she hadn't forced my hand. The first thing I checked was her email. The mundane clutter of promotional offers and work memos almost lulled me into a false sense of relief, until I found a separate folder hidden under an innocuous name, something like travel plans. It was the kind of folder you'd overlook if you weren't looking for trouble. But I was. Inside were email threads between her and Jack, along with several others whose names I didn't recognize. They weren't outright romantic, at least not at first glance, but the tone was unmistakable. Secretive, flirtatious, laden with subtext. Phrases like, let's keep this between us, and I can't wait to see you again, left little room for misinterpretation. Worse, there were receipts. Hotel bookings. Dinners at expensive restaurants I had never been invited to. One message even mentioned a weekend conference, one she'd told me was for work. Now I knew the truth. The conference was real, but she hadn't gone alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just a fleeting affair. It was calculated, intentional. But Jack wasn't the only one. There were messages from another man, someone named David, with a similar tone. My hands gripped the edge of the desk as I read on, barely able to breathe. She had lied to my face with such ease, spinning tales of long workdays and professional obligations, all while building a double life I had no part in. The betrayal felt endless, like I'd stumbled into a pit with no bottom. That night, I could hardly look at her. She came home late, as usual, her heels clicking on the tile floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. She greeted me with the same detached warmth she'd perfected over the past months, the kind that now felt rehearsed. I responded with the bare minimum, afraid my voice might betray the storm raging inside me. As she disappeared into the shower, I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the table where we used to eat dinner together. It had been months since we'd sat down as a couple, months since I'd felt like anything more than a ghost in my own home. Every shared moment now felt like a lie, every smile a mask. The next day, I took time off work and visited the hotel she'd frequented with Jack. I didn't know what I hoped to find. Maybe a record of her stays, maybe confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. What I didn't expect was for the receptionist to remember her. When I gave her name, the woman at the desk smiled politely, saying something about how she'd always been a great guest. She asked if I'd like a copy of the receipt for her recent visit. I nodded, my stomach churning. There it was, in black and white. A 2-night stay just a week ago, during one of her so-called business trips. I thanked the receptionist and left, gripping the receipt like it was a confession. My hands trembled as I sat in the car, staring at the evidence. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was how easy she'd made it look, how carelessly she'd dismantled everything we'd built together. When I got home, I placed the receipt in a drawer, alongside printouts of her emails and screenshots from her phone. I didn't need to confront her yet. Not until I was ready. For now, I wanted her to keep lying, keep pretending. I wanted to see how far she would take this act, how much more she thought she could get away with. Over the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I went to work, came home, and nodded along to her stories about her hectic days. Each lie she told only strengthened my resolve. I felt a quiet, simmering rage building inside me, a kind of cold determination I didn't know I had. By the end of that week, I had enough. Enough evidence, enough rage, enough clarity. This wasn't just an affair. This was a pattern, a choice she had made over and over again. And I was done pretending I didn't see it. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. The moment came sooner than I expected. That Friday evening, Laura told me she'd be working late again, the same tired excuse she'd used countless times. But this time, I didn't let her words wash over me like I usually did. I told her I'd have dinner ready when she got home, pretending to brush off her vague explanations like I always did. She didn't even look up as she slipped on her coat, grabbing her purse with an air of indifference. Once she left, I sat there in the silence of our house, staring at the table where her untouched plate would be later. This wasn't just my home anymore. It was a stage for her deceit. Every room, every piece of furniture, now felt tainted. But tonight, I wasn't going to sit idly by. Tonight, I was going to end the show. I waited until I was sure she was gone, then followed the route I'd mapped out in my mind, the route I was certain she'd take. Sure enough, her car was parked outside the small hotel on the edge of town, the same hotel from the receipt I'd found. I parked across the street, out of sight, and waited. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. An hour passed before she emerged, and she wasn't alone. Jack was with her, his hand on her lower back as they walked toward the entrance. They didn't seem to care who saw them, as though the world outside their bubble didn't exist. I felt my stomach twist as I watched them laugh, their faces lit with an ease that I hadn't seen from Laura in years. I followed them into the hotel, keeping my distance as they checked in. The receptionist handed them a key, barely glancing up. I waited for them to disappear into the elevator before stepping up to the counter. With the same practiced calm I'd been wearing all week, I gave the receptionist Laura's name and asked for their room number. It was easier than I thought it would be. Within moments, I was heading upstairs, the key card in my hand a strange weight. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. This was it, the moment I'd see everything for what it was. There was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, I slid the keycard into the slot and opened the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. Jack and Laura were tangled together on the bed, their laughter dying the moment they saw me standing there. For a split second, no one moved. Then Jack scrambled to sit up, his face pale. Laura grabbed a blanket, clutching it to her chest as though it could shield her from the truth I'd uncovered. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I simply stood there, staring at the two people who had turned my life into a lie. My silence must have unnerved them because Jack started stammering, trying to explain himself, but his words were a jumble of excuses and apologies. I didn't care to hear them. His regret meant nothing to me. My focus shifted to Laura. Her face was flushed, but it wasn't shame or remorse I saw, it was fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the comfortable life I'd provided. She knew in that moment that her game was over. But instead of admitting her guilt, she did what she always did, she lied. She tried to spin a story, something about a misunderstanding or needing space from the pressures of our marriage. Her words were hollow, empty, as though even she didn't believe them. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The evidence was lying right in front of me, tangled in hotel sheets that weren't ours. Jack, however, was panicking. He offered to leave, to stay away from Laura if that's what I wanted. He practically begged for forgiveness, his voice shaking with desperation. But his pleas only fueled my anger. How dare he think he could undo this with a few words? I took a step toward him, my presence alone enough to make him flinch. I didn't lay a hand on him. I didn't need to. The humiliation in his eyes was enough. I told him to leave, calmly, firmly, as though I were dismissing an employee who had overstepped his bounds. He gathered his clothes in a hurry, not even looking at Laura as he fled the room. And then it was just the two of us. Laura sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her face a mask of disbelief. She tried to speak again, to salvage what little control she thought she had, but I cut her off with a single look. I could see her struggling to decide whether to fight or surrender, but in the end, she said nothing. She must have known there was nothing left to say. Without a word, I turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the room that now reeked of betrayal. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt an odd sense of calm. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something else, a sense of finality. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do. This wasn't about saving the marriage anymore. It wasn't about understanding her reasons or finding some way to forgive her. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity. Whatever came next, it wouldn't include her lies. The next morning, Laura came home, looking disheveled and uncharacteristically subdued. She barely made eye contact as she stepped through the door, her heels clacking against the hardwood floor in what felt like a drumbeat of defiance. I watched her from the kitchen, the coffee I'd brewed growing cold in my hand. She didn't speak at first, just set her purse down and glanced around the room as if searching for something familiar. But there was nothing left here for her. The home we'd built together was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield, and she had already lost. When she finally turned to face me, her expression shifted. It wasn't remorse that I saw, but calculation. Laura had always been good at talking her way out of tight corners, spinning half-truths into convincing tales. She must have thought she could do it again. But this wasn't a simple mistake or misunderstanding. This was a betrayal so deep, so complete, that no amount of manipulation could fix it. She started with denial. It was her go-to move, the easiest way to muddy the waters. She insisted that I had misunderstood what I saw, that Jack was just a friend, and that I'd overreacted. She painted herself as a victim, someone whose privacy had been invaded by a paranoid husband. Her words were carefully chosen, each one designed to plant seeds of doubt. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and I wasn't the same naive man I'd been just weeks ago. When denial didn't work, she shifted tactics. The lies came fast and fluid, like she'd rehearsed them 100 times in her head. She claimed that Jack had been pursuing her for months, that she had tried to push him away but couldn't avoid him because they worked together. She said she had no choice but to meet him outside of work to clear the air. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Her excuses were riddled with inconsistencies, each one contradicting the last, but she didn't seem to notice, or care. She was too focused on controlling the narrative to see how transparent she had become. And then came the justifications, the part of her performance that stung the most. Laura blamed me. She said I'd been distant, that I spent too much time at work and not enough with her. She accused me of taking her for granted, of failing to make her feel special. It was as if she had taken every sacrifice I'd made for our life together and twisted it into a reason for her betrayal. She told me that the attention she'd received from other men, Jack, David, and God knows who else, had filled a void I had supposedly left. Her words were cruel, calculated to shift the blame onto me, but I knew better. Her infidelity wasn't my fault, and no amount of emotional manipulation could make me believe otherwise. When I didn't respond, she grew more desperate. Her tone softened, her words taking on a pleading edge. She said she didn't mean to hurt me, that she'd made mistakes but still loved me. She promised to change, to cut ties with Jack and focus on rebuilding what we'd lost. But her eyes betrayed her. There was no sincerity in them, no real remorse. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, she was sorry she'd been caught. Her performance reached its climax when she broke down in tears, a last-ditch effort to appeal to my sympathy. She sobbed about how difficult things had been for her, how lonely she'd felt despite everything I'd done to make her happy. It was a masterful display, one that might have worked on the man I used to be. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had seen the truth, and no amount of tears could erase it. I let her finish, watching as she wiped her face and waited for my reaction. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. For the first time, I saw her as she truly was. Selfish, manipulative, and utterly incapable of taking responsibility for her actions. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had loved and trusted, was gone. In her place stood a stranger, someone who would rather lie and deflect than face the consequences of her choices. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how deeply she had hurt me, but the words wouldn't come. The anger I felt was cold now, a steady burn that refused to erupt. Instead, I turned away, leaving her standing there in the kitchen with her crocodile tears and her empty promises. I didn't need to explain myself to her. She already knew. That night, she tried again. She hovered around me, making small talk, asking if I wanted dinner, pretending as though we could sweep this under the rug and carry on as if nothing had happened. But I refused to engage. I didn't owe her kindness, not after what she had done. The distance between us grew palpable, a chasm that no amount of her manipulative charm could bridge. She was a skilled liar, but her web of deceit had finally unraveled, and there was no putting it back together. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the realization that she had never truly valued me the way I had valued her. By the time I went to bed, I knew there was no saving this marriage. Laura's lies and excuses had only solidified my resolve. She didn't regret what she'd done, she regretted losing control. And I wasn't about to let her regain it. By the time the weekend rolled around, the air in the house was thick with tension. Laura's attempts to repair the damage felt hollow, like someone trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. She kept busying herself with chores she'd long ignored, acting as though her sudden burst of domesticity would erase the betrayal. She asked me more than once if I wanted to talk, but the way she said it made it clear she wasn't looking for a real conversation, just an opportunity to rewrite the narrative in her favor. I wasn't interested. I spent most of those days in silence, watching her move around the house with a mix of nervous energy and forced cheerfulness. She was putting on a performance, but I wasn't the audience anymore. My focus was on the next steps, on how to disentangle my life from hers without letting her pull me down any further. Then, on Sunday evening, she cracked. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching it, when Laura walked in. She had that look on her face, the one she always wore when she wanted to have her way but wasn't sure how to get it. For a moment, she just stood there, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater, waiting for me to acknowledge her. I didn't. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, almost accusatory. She said she couldn't take the silence anymore, that we needed to address what had happened. But I could tell from her tone that this wasn't about reconciliation, it was about control. She wasn't looking to make things right. She was looking to shift the power dynamic back in her favor. She started listing off reasons why I should forgive her, each one more self-serving than the last. She talked about our history, about the years we'd spent building a life together, as though the past could somehow justify the betrayal. She brought up the good times we'd shared, the vacations, the milestones, as if those memories could erase the image of her in that hotel room with Jack. It was pathetic, really, watching her grasp at straws. When that didn't work, she turned to guilt. She said she'd made a mistake, but didn't I make mistakes too? Didn't I owe her a second chance, just as she'd supposedly given me the benefit of the doubt so many times before? Her voice rose as she talked, her words dripping with desperation. She accused me of being unforgiving, of wanting to punish her rather than repair our marriage. She claimed I was the one throwing everything away now, not her. I let her rant, saying nothing as she spiraled further into self-pity. Her arguments grew more erratic, more frantic, until she finally blurted out the one thing I had been waiting for, a threat. She said if I left her, she would make the divorce as messy as possible. She would go after the house, the savings, everything. She even hinted that she might spin the narrative to paint herself as the victim, to make it seem like I was the one who had driven her into Jack's arms. That was the moment I realized there was no point in engaging with her anymore. This wasn't a conversation, it was a negotiation, and she was playing dirty. She didn't care about saving our marriage. She cared about saving face, about holding on to the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. Her tears, her pleading, even her threats, it was all part of a game I wanted no part of. I stood up slowly, cutting off whatever self-serving monologue she was about to launch into next. My silence seemed to unnerve her, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing me, she'd already made it clear she was willing to risk that, but fear of losing control. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I was done. Done with the lies, the manipulation, the toxic cycle she was trying to drag me into. I didn't raise my voice or throw accusations. I didn't need to. The weight of my words was enough. Her face crumbled as the reality of the situation hit her, but I didn't linger to see her reaction. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to stew in the mess she'd created. That night, I started drafting the divorce papers. It wasn't an easy decision. It never is when you've built your life around someone, but it was the only decision that made sense. Laura had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and her lack of remorse had only solidified my resolve. There was no coming back from this, no repairing the damage. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. As I sat at the kitchen table, typing out the first draft of what would soon become our separation, I felt an odd sense of relief. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something else: clarity. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Laura's threats didn't scare me anymore. Let her try to take the house, the money, whatever she wanted. None of it mattered. What mattered was reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect, and my life. She could keep her lies and excuses. I was done listening. The days that followed were a blur of tension and cold exchanges. Laura tried alternating between silence and small bursts of effort to act like nothing had changed. She'd offer to make dinner or suggest we spend some time together, but her words were hollow, just like everything else she'd said since I discovered the truth. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a response. Every interaction felt like a battle for control, and I wasn't about to play her game. Filing for divorce was easier than I expected. I thought the act of walking into the lawyer's office would weigh on me like a failure, but instead, it felt like a release. The attorney listened intently as I laid out the facts, their expression shifting to one of grim understanding when I mentioned Laura's infidelity and the threats she'd made about taking everything. I handed over the stack of evidence I had collected, the emails, the receipts, even photos I'd printed from her phone. Each piece of proof felt like a piece of my life, laid bare on the desk for a stranger to examine. But I didn't feel ashamed. This wasn't my failure. It was hers. The attorney assured me I was in a strong position, which offered some relief. Still, I knew this wasn't going to be an easy process. Laura was stubborn, and she wasn't going to let go without a fight. I braced myself for what was coming, knowing the worst was yet to come. When I finally told Laura about the divorce, her reaction was explosive. I waited until the papers were drafted and ready to be served, wanting to make sure I had every detail locked down before I confronted her. She was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through her phone, when I dropped the folder in front of her. For a moment, she didn't react, her eyes darting between the papers and my face as if trying to process what was happening. Then the storm hit. She screamed at me, accusing me of giving up on our marriage, of being cruel and heartless for even considering a divorce. Her words were laced with venom, each one meant to wound, but I didn't flinch. She tried to turn it back on me, claiming I was the one who had driven her away, that my long hours at work and emotional distance had left her no choice but to seek comfort elsewhere. It was laughable, really, her trying to justify her betrayal as my failure. I stayed silent, letting her words bounce off me like raindrops on stone. When she realized her accusations weren't landing, she shifted to tears. She sobbed about how she'd made mistakes, but we could fix it if I just gave her another chance. She promised to cut ties with Jack, to be a better wife, to prove her love for me. But her tears felt rehearsed, a desperate attempt to manipulate me one last time. I didn't budge. Her final act was rage. She tore into me with every insult she could muster, calling me weak, unloving, and ungrateful for the sacrifices she claimed to have made for our marriage. She swore she'd take everything in the divorce: the house, the money, even the dog. Her voice was shrill, almost hysterical, but all I could feel was pity. She wasn't fighting for me or our marriage. She was fighting for her pride, for the illusion of control she'd clung to for so long. After she stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her, I sat in silence for a long time. The weight of what I'd done started to settle in, not regret, but a quiet acknowledgement of the road ahead. This wasn't going to be quick or clean. Laura wasn't the type to let go without a fight, and I knew she'd drag this out for as long as she could. But I was ready for it. I had no choice but to be. Over the next few weeks, the fallout began to spread. Laura made good on her threats, telling mutual friends and even family members that I was the one to blame for the divorce. She painted herself as a victim, claiming she had made one small mistake and that I was overreacting. It was infuriating to watch her twist the truth, but I kept my focus on the bigger picture. I wasn't about to stoop to her level. Some people sided with her, of course. I lost a few friends who bought into her version of events, but the ones who mattered stuck by me. My closest friends saw through her lies, offering their support and reminding me that I wasn't the one who had destroyed our marriage. Their encouragement was a lifeline during those dark weeks, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Laura's family, to my surprise, didn't jump to her defense. Her parents had always been distant, but when they found out about her infidelity, they were furious. Her mother called me one evening, apologizing on Laura's behalf and asking if there was any chance I'd reconsider. I told her the truth, that this wasn't just one mistake, but a pattern of betrayal that I couldn't forgive. She seemed to understand, though it was clear she felt helpless in the face of her daughter's actions. The hardest part was dealing with Laura directly. She alternated between icy detachment and fiery rage, depending on her mood. One day she'd act as though the divorce was a mere inconvenience, casually asking if we could split things amicably. The next, she'd launch into a tirade about how she deserved half of everything and more. Each interaction drained me, but I refused to let her see it. She thrived on conflict, and I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. The divorce process was grueling, as expected. There were meetings with lawyers, endless paperwork, and heated arguments over property and finances. Laura fought tooth and nail for every inch, dragging out the process longer than necessary. But through it all, I stayed firm. I knew what I wanted: my freedom, my dignity, and a clean break from the woman who had betrayed me. By the end of it, I had lost some things, material possessions mostly, but I'd gained something far more valuable: clarity. Laura could take the house, the money, whatever she thought would make her whole again. None of it mattered. What mattered was that I was finally free. After Laura moved out, the silence in the house was deafening. For the first few days, I didn't know what to do with myself. The space that once felt like a battlefield now felt eerily empty, like a hollow shell of the life we had built together. Her things were gone, at least most of them, but traces of her lingered everywhere. The empty closet, the faint scent of her perfume in the bedroom, even the kitchen where her favorite mug used to sit. It was a constant reminder of what I'd lost. Not her, but the life I thought I had. I started small, cleaning, rearranging, making the house feel like mine again. It was strange, the small satisfaction I felt in throwing out the things she'd left behind. The pillow she used to sleep on. The bottle of wine she never finished. Every item I tossed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like I was shedding the weight of her betrayal one small act at a time. The first week was the hardest. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes without my mind drifting back to her. I replayed the moments of discovery over and over again, searching for the signs I'd missed, the red flags I'd ignored. I wondered if there had been a way to stop it, to fix it before it had spiraled out of control. But every time I reached the same conclusion: this wasn't my fault. Laura had made her choices, and now I was making mine. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into it with a kind of single-minded determination that surprised even me. Long hours, tight deadlines, anything to keep my mind busy. My coworkers noticed, of course, but I kept the details vague, brushing off their questions with half-truths. Just a rough patch, I'd say, or personal stuff. They didn't press, and I was grateful for that. Outside of work, I began reconnecting with people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends who I'd drifted away from, neighbors I barely knew. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done since the early years of our marriage. At first, it was just to burn off the restless energy that seemed to consume me. But over time, it became something more, a routine, a place where I could clear my head and focus on something other than the wreckage Laura had left behind. I even picked up a hobby: woodworking. It was something I'd always been curious about but never had the time or energy to pursue. Now, with nothing holding me back, I threw myself into it. I started small, building a shelf for the living room, then a coffee table. The process was meditative, each cut and measurement a small act of creation in the wake of so much destruction. It gave me a sense of control, something I desperately needed. The hardest part of moving on was confronting the doubts Laura had planted in my mind. Her accusations about my work habits, my supposed distance, lingered like shadows, whispering that maybe I had failed her in some way. But as the weeks passed, those whispers grew quieter. I began to see her words for what they were: excuses, attempts to justify the choices she'd made. I wasn't perfect, but I had given her everything I could. Her betrayal wasn't about me, It was about her own selfishness. There were moments of weakness, of course. Nights when the silence became too loud, and I'd find myself staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. But those moments became fewer as time went on. Slowly, I began to rebuild, piece by piece. Friends and family played a huge role in that. My closest friends rallied around me, offering support without judgment. My sister, who had never been Laura's biggest fan, called me almost every day, just to check in. My parents, though initially shocked by the divorce, were nothing but supportive once they heard the full story. Even Laura's mother reached out once, apologizing again for her daughter's actions and wishing me well. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something had shifted. The anger that had consumed me for weeks was no longer as sharp. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was no longer the defining force in my life. In its place was something else, a sense of acceptance. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control what came next. I started thinking about the future, something I hadn't allowed myself to do since the divorce began. It wasn't about finding someone new or rushing to fill the void Laura had left. It was about figuring out who I was without her, what kind of life I wanted to build now that I was free to do so. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't instant. Healing never is. But step by step, I was reclaiming my life. The betrayal that had once defined me was beginning to fade, no longer the center of my world but a lesson I would carry forward. Laura had taken so much from me, but she hadn't taken everything. There were still pieces of me left to rebuild, and I was determined to make something stronger out of them. The day the divorce was finalized felt oddly anticlimactic. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic outburst. Just a sterile courtroom, a judge reading the terms, and a few signatures that marked the official end of my marriage. Laura didn't look at me once during the hearing, though I caught glimpses of her stealing glances out of the corner of my eye. I wondered if she felt regret, but at that point, it didn't matter. Regret couldn't undo what she'd done, and I wasn't interested in hearing any more of her excuses. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse without a word. The air outside felt lighter, cleaner, as though I'd stepped out of a cage I hadn't realized I'd been trapped in for years. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, letting the finality of it wash over me. It was done. I was free. In the weeks that followed, Laura tried to reach out a few times. Her texts started cautiously, with a veneer of civility, asking how I was doing, if we could meet to talk things over. When I didn't respond, the messages grew more desperate. She claimed she wanted to apologize, that she'd realized how deeply she'd hurt me and wanted to make amends. But I knew better. This wasn't about closure or remorse. It was about control. She wanted to see if she could still manipulate me, if there was any part of me that still belonged to her. I never answered. Eventually, her messages stopped. One evening, I heard from a mutual friend that Laura had moved out of town. She'd left her job, packed her things, and disappeared to a city a few hours away. The news didn't spark any strong emotions in me. Not relief, not sadness, not even curiosity. It was just another chapter closing, another tie severed. I wished her no ill will, but I also had no room in my life for her anymore. I focused on continuing to rebuild. My woodworking hobby turned into something bigger, almost a side business. I started selling pieces online and at local markets, finding joy in creating something with my own hands. Each project felt like a small victory, proof that I could build something beautiful out of nothing. It was a quiet, steady form of healing, one that kept me grounded. I also began reconnecting with myself in ways I hadn't realized I needed. I took a solo trip to the mountains, something I'd always talked about but never prioritized. I hiked for hours, the quiet of the wilderness clearing my head in a way nothing else could. Standing at the summit, looking out over miles of untouched forest, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was a reminder that the world was so much bigger than the pain Laura had caused, that my life didn't have to be defined by her betrayal. As time passed, the bitterness began to fade. It didn't happen all at once, and there were still moments when the memories crept in uninvited. But each day, they held less power over me. I stopped questioning what I could have done differently, stopped replaying the moments that led to the end. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about letting go. Eventually, I started thinking about the possibility of meeting someone new. Not because I felt incomplete without a partner, but because I realized I still had love to give. I wanted to share my life with someone who valued loyalty and honesty, someone who could see the person I'd become after everything I'd been through. It wasn't about filling a void, it was about starting fresh. But I wasn't in a rush. For the first time in years, I felt comfortable being alone. I filled my days with work, hobbies, and time with friends, savoring the freedom to live life on my own terms. It was a kind of independence I hadn't realized I'd been missing, a chance to rediscover who I was outside the shadow of a broken marriage. One afternoon, as I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, it all seemed like a distant memory now, a chapter in a book I was ready to close. Laura's choices had shattered my world, but they had also forced me to rebuild, to find strength I didn't know I had. I didn't hate her anymore. In some strange way, I even felt grateful. Not for the pain she caused, but for the lessons it taught me. She had shown me what I deserved and, more importantly, what I would never settle for again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I was excited to see where it would take me. The past was behind me, and the future was wide open. It was time to move forward, not as a man defined by betrayal, but as someone who had chosen resilience, self-respect, and a new beginning.